This section is going to go through the many kind of cognitive functions of the brain. And one of the ways that we study the normal functions of the brain is through electroencephalogram, EEG. And so these are usually nodes that are placed on the skin, and they study the brain waves, if you will. There are 4 different types of waves. So alpha waves are common when you're resting but not asleep. So if you were to lie down in like a cool dark room and close your eyes, you would mostly have alpha waves. Beta waves are what you have when you open your eyes or you're receiving sensory information or you're stimulated. Theta waves are common when you're drowsy or sleeping in adults. These are common in children that are awake. But when theta waves are seen in adults that are awake, this could signal that they have emotional distress or some kind of brain disorder. And then delta waves are these really slow waves that are common during deep sleep. These are also common when infants are awake. But if an adult had delta waves while they were awake, that would be an indicator of severe brain damage. Sleep is a temporary unconsciousness, and it's temporary. You can be awoken from it when stimulated. And when you're sleeping, you typically go through several stages of sleep. So stage 1 would be when you're kind of drowsy, relaxed, your thoughts kind of come and go, but you could awaken very easily. Stage 2 happens where you're kind of lightly sleeping. You move into stage 3. Stage 3 is when your muscles start to relax. This is a moderate to deep sleep. Your vital signs fall, so like your body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate. And then stage 4 would be slow wave sleep. So this is deep sleep. Your muscles are very relaxed. You're very difficult to awaken. And then often during the night, we step back up through those stages to 2 to 3. And then instead of going back to stage 1, we go into something called REM sleep, REM. And it's named REM sleep for rapid eye movement because the eyes oscillate, they shake back and forth. And if you do an EEG here, it actually looks like you're more awake because the body is metabolically active. So your vital signs increase, your brain's consuming energy. What we think is happening here is called consolidating memories. So this is often where your memories would be being replayed back during the day, and studies have shown that animals who don't get enough REM sleep are often forgetful. So if you look over the course of a night, the amount of REM sleep for each sleep cycle gets longer and longer. So this is why I always recommend you get really good sleep the night before a test, because if you just spent a lot of time studying, but you don't actually get any REM sleep, you're not actually going to remember what you studied. Normal sleep, so stages 1 through 4, is very restorative. This is where we restore our body functions. This is where our ATP and glycogen levels get reduced. Having sleep deprivation, so not sleeping enough, can cause severe body damage and can also be fatal. So our brain has many cognitive functions. A cognition is just a mental process where we acquire and use some sort of knowledge. So sensory perception, thought, reasoning, judgment, memory, intuition, imagination. These are very difficult and not completely understood. Most cognitive functions are understood from patients who have a disorder or lesion in the part of the brain that impairs one of these cognitive functions. And that's how we learn what parts of the brain contribute towards cognition. So memory is one of these cognitive functions. And memory has 3 parts. It's got learning, which is the acquiring of new information. Memory, which is storing information in the brain, but also being able to retrieve it when you want to. And then forgetting is just as important for eliminating trivial information. Memory is mostly associated with the hippocampus. And this is our important memory forming center. So during REM sleep, our hippocampus replays the memories to the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is much better at storing long-term memories, but it's a slow learner. So the hippocampus replays it over and over and over again in that process of memory consolidation. Amnesia is a deficit in explicit memory. So an explicit memory would be trying to specifically remember something like what happened yesterday. Amnesia would not likely affect an implicit memory, which would be something more like remembering how to tie your shoes. Our brain is responsible for our emotions, and we have two main regions that are contributing to our emotions. The first one is this prefrontal cortex, so this would be right behind your forehead, right behind your frontal bone, and then this is part of the neocortex, right, that superficial layer of the cerebrum. And this is where we decide how we are going to express our emotions. So this is our area of judgment, intent, control. This is typically not going to mature until approximately age 25. So if you think about teenagers or children who are not very good at expressing or controlling their emotions, that's because their prefrontal cortex is not fully mature. This is why often when we get older, we think back, oh, that was really dumb. Why would I have done that? That's because now you would not make a decision necessarily the same way you would before your prefrontal cortex matures. The amygdala receives sensory information and then promotes an emotional response. So the amygdala is the place where we actually have the emotion begin. So things like fear, and it controls fear, food intake, sexual behavior, other stimuli. We have a lot of sensory information from the body that goes to the brain, and we classify this into special senses and general senses. So a special sense is limited to the complex sensory organs in the head. So those would be your eyes for vision, your ears for hearing and equilibrium, your tongue for taste, and your nose for smell. So all of those are on your head. And the places where we receive sensory information is called the primary sensory cortex. And there's a different primary cortex for each of the different special senses. So for vision, our primary visual cortex is back here in the occipital lobe. For hearing, our primary auditory cortex is over here on the side of the temporal lobe, as well as deep into the insula. Equilibrium, so equilibrium is your sense of balance. This is going to be found in the cerebellum, as well as into the brainstem. Taste, so gustation is taste. And this is found right here in the parietal at the very bottom of this primary somatosensory cortex. And then olfaction, this is smell, is found down here on the medial side of the temporal lobe and then the inferior side of the frontal lobe. Our general senses are the other senses that you feel throughout your body. So things like touch, pressure, heat, when something stretches, cold, pain. And these have relatively simple receptors, and they're spread throughout the entire body. These signals are sent to the post-central gyrus. So that is right here, this dark purple. And then again, it would be right here on this side, in the parietal lobe. And so you can see that this has mapped the region of the body to how much neural tissue it gets on the post-central gyrus. And this is not proportionate to the size of the body. It's proportionate to the number of nerves in that region. So how sensitive is that region? So you can see places like the lips and the tongue and the genitalia are very large, as well as the hand, because those regions are very sensitive. Whereas regions like the neck, back, hips, and buttocks are not very sensitive and have a relatively smaller region of the brain. So after we receive a sensory information, we have to usually send out some sort of motor response. So we also have a gyrus for motor control, and this is the precentral gyrus, and you can see this one was colored in blue up here, and then you can see it on this side as well. And this is part of the frontal lobe. And the mapping for this one looks very similar, only now instead of receiving information, we're actually sending information to those locations. So the size of the area mapped to it is relative to the number of motor units. So we have a lot of motor units that control the tongue, because there's a lot of dexterous movement, as well as the hands, the face, the lips, because we use those for very delicate, small motions. Whereas other regions, again, like the legs, back, torso, we don't use those for very delicate, small motions, so we don't need a lot of motor units in those areas. Our brain is also involved in interpreting as well as understanding language. So language includes a lot of different things like reading, writing, speaking, sign language, and understanding words. And there's two main areas. There's the Wernicke area, which is right here in yellow. And then there's the Broca area, which is right over here in pink. So the Wernicke area is responsible for recognition of listening as well as written language. And then when you're going to speak, the Wernicke area transmits information to the Broca area. So studies have shown that when somebody is about to speak, the Broca area lights up and has a lot of activity before you speak or before you sign, because the brain interprets sign language the same way as speaking. Aphasia is when there's a language deficient, and there's a lot of different types of aphasia depending on which area of the brain is damaged. So if the Broca area is damaged, often this is going to lead to like slow speech, difficulty choosing words. And if the Wernicke area is damaged, then the speech might be normal, but the person might use completely nonsense words that aren't actually understood. So our brain is separated into two sides, and these are lateralized. So lateral is to the side. The two hemispheres are about the same size. Sometimes the left hemisphere is a little bit larger, depending on the person. But we don't have a dominant hemisphere. We typically use both hemispheres about equally. However, they do become specialized. And so that's what lateralization is. It's not that one's dominant over the other, but that they have slightly different functions. Typically the left is referred to as the categorical. And so this is going to be involved in things like rational thought, language comprehension. People who are left-brained might be very good with logic. And then the right is considered the representational. This is going to have memory for shapes, motor control, musical, intuitive. So somebody who's right-brained, quote unquote, might be considered like artistic. And these develop with age. So when a young child has damage on one or the other side of the brain, the other brain can actually pick up the function, and then they show fewer deficits. But when people who have brain damage later on in life, they have a harder time lateralizing, and so those specialized areas get damaged, and then we see deficits. So take a moment and describe how the brain functions in acquiring memory as well as the storage of memory.